Thanks. Thank you, everyone. It's good to see you. Welcome to UIW. So happy that you're here, and it's maybe a little bit of a difficult thing to be the first speaker. Okay, this is live, so should I do that? Is that better? Yeah, okay. So you heard what I said, though? Yeah, all right. So it's a little bit of a strange thing maybe to be the 8 o'clock speaker on a Friday towards the end of the semester, but on the other hand, we get to talk about music, which is the best thing. For me, certainly, but I hope that you also have found a lot of enjoyment going through this part of the study guide. Last year, I think we were talking about American music, right, and American colonial music. Much of that was very obscure. So if you were in Academic last year, then you probably had this experience of, wow, I've never heard of this music and all of it's totally unfamiliar. This year, however, a lot of this music is profoundly familiar and is something that we encounter all the time. In various places. So Star Wars was one of the movies that's discussed in the resource guide. Well, the Yosa Philharmonic here in San Antonio at their first concert of the season played a Star Wars suite. So, you know, I don't know, we have a Yosa person here, so maybe you played that music, I don't know. But so this music is everywhere, and it's also deeply, deeply influential. So we were having a conversation just before this event started about Marvel Cinematic Universe and all the Marvel movies, and how many students watch those now and how many students don't watch the movies that are in the resource guide. These movies were my bread and butter. Like, I grew up with these movies. I should have written this resource guide myself. You know, I feel like I could have. Maybe I did somehow, you know. Like, these movies are deeply familiar. They're part of my life. For you, maybe this is not the case. However, the movies that you do watch, the video games that you do play, owe a massive debt of gratitude to these films. So if you really study these films, you're going to see those connections. You're going to see how art begets art, how artist inspires artist, and how artists draw from the previous generation of artistic product to create what they do and make it impactful. So don't just imagine that, like, Academic or the Texas Academic Decathlon is the end of your journey with these pieces, with these movies, with this music. I mean, fortunately, music is a lifetime journey, and you can continue to learn things, not only from these films, but from their intersection with other things that you enjoy, other things, games that you play, and movies that you watch. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the structure of the resource guide, just very briefly, and then there's no way, as you know, like in 45 minutes, that may seem like a long time. To me, talking about these films, this is like, I don't even get to say anything. So I feel like we could spend easily, you want to just hang out for the next 5 days or so and unpack one film? I mean, I think maybe that's the amount of time that it would take to even deal with one film that's discussed in this resource guide. We don't have that time, we have 45 minutes. So what we're going to do instead is talk about 6 films. That's not all the films in the resource guide, as you know. So there will be things that you're talking about. We talked about Mars Attacks just before this event started, and I don't know how many of you have watched that or talked about the music or thought about that film yet. We won't talk about Mars Attacks today, sorry, spoiler alert. However, we will talk about, sorry, that was like a resource guide joke because it says spoiler alert, right? Sorry. But we will talk about 6 films, and I love all 6 films for various reasons. I mean, I truly love them. And this is a little bit of an embarrassing, it feels like a bit of a confession or something. Here we are at a Catholic institution, so maybe that's appropriate. But I mean, I love these films. I can't help it. They're either guilty pleasures or just pleasures. I'm a composer myself, so these films have also inspired me as a composer. I've drawn from them, sometimes inevitably, sometimes on purpose. And each of these films, like I was saying before, I almost felt like I could have written this resource guide. If I were writing a resource guide and the challenge were, write about science fiction film scores, I know that I would have taken some of these same films and probably drawn on some of the same cues that are discussed. So I really think there's a lot to chew on here. So we'll get to that, but we'll only have a chance to talk about 6 films. Okay, so section 1 of your resource guide is all about music theory fundamentals. So it's always a question, because this is what the music resource guides seem to do. They spend a lot of time talking about basics, right? So you talk about how to read music, you talk about chords, you talk about qualities of chords, you talk about rhythm and how to read rhythm. That's difficult. That's difficult stuff. And if you have a background in music, then it's not difficult for you. It's natural for you. It's like reading for you. But if you don't have that background in music, then it's like, how could I ever climb over this impossibly high wall? How could I ever get there? So you know how this works. Like sometimes in a particular team, some people really know how to do that stuff and other people might not have such a great grasp on it. So you kind of balance each other's strengths and weaknesses out. And that's great. However, just know that in the resource guide, there's a lot of material there for you to consult if you're interested in starting to learn how to read music. That's, again, a lifelong pursuit. One of the cool things about it is if you learn how to read music, and if you come back to it regularly, that's a gift for life. It's something that you can always do, that you can always go back to. I love this. Do you know, like even though now I'm associate deaning a lot of my time, and only in the classroom sometime, every morning I play. Every morning I play J.S. Bach, or I play Mendelssohn, or I play some composer because it gives me that tactile connection to music, that sort of, I don't know, the feeling of music in my fingers. So I highly encourage you, if you're at all interested in music, see if you can figure out how to read it. See if you can put that into practice. It's a great challenge, and again, it's a lifelong pursuit that's lifelong rewarding. Okay, so section 1 of the resource guide, we can't really talk about. We could talk about chord qualities, and that would be exciting for me, maybe, and for 3 or 4 other people. But I don't know how useful it would be for those of you who are still trying to get over that initial wall of music theory. So we won't spend a lot of time on that today. However, if you should ever have any questions about music theory, and if your coaches are wondering how do we do this, or I don't understand this, and if there's nobody who can immediately answer a question, we're happy. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about the real meat of the resource guide. After that first section, there are 3 more sections. And I like the way that it organizes things. One is sort of traditional in orientation. One is all about doing new things with technology. And the last one is about music as a character, in a way, or music playing a role directly in the film. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. First one, 2001, A Space Odyssey. I'm going to ask this every time. I just can't help myself. Please forgive me. I know it's a little bit silly. I just can't resist. How many of you have seen 2001, A Space Odyssey, by show of hands? See this film. See this film. This is one of the greatest films ever made by human hand. So Stanley Kubrick, one of the great auteur directors of the 20th century. I don't know if you have talked about auteur director and what that means, but an auteur is a director who's like an author, whose stamp, whose signature is so present in almost every frame of the film that you can't get away from it. Like, this is a Kubrick film. You can't mistake it. So if you've seen The Shining, if you've seen, any of those, Dr. Strangelove, if you've seen any of those films, you know that Kubrick has this amazing filmic capacity. He's a great director. And 2001, A Space Odyssey is by far, well, I don't know if I can say by far, but one of his trippiest, strangest, most upsetting, most mesmerizing, most amazing films. I can't recommend it more highly. See this film. So those of you who have seen it, I would love to just ask you and hear from you about what your experience of this film was. This format kind of makes that weird. It kind of makes it difficult to have a conversation like that. So I'm sorry. I would love to hear your ideas and hear your responses about what your experience was watching this film. But as you see from this image, this is the Star Child image from 2001: A Space Odyssey, and you see some stills in your resource guide that show you that the cinematography in the film is amazing. Like, the images that you see are unforgettable. But I want to talk a little bit about this Star Child and its connection to a cue. As we go through each slide, I'll show you a still, and we'll talk about some key concepts from the resource guide, and we'll also talk a little more generally about the cue and about music in the movie. So first of all, I want to talk about process, because this is something the resource guide asks you to learn. So it's reasonable to expect that you'll have questions that are about these things when you take your music portion of the test. So one of the things that it talks about is how you put together film and where scoring comes in that process. So you know that there's pre-production, that's the planning that leads up to the actual shoot. Then there's production, which is what we're doing right now, if you look at our friend back there. Yep. Then we have post-production, which is editing the thing together. So you can, ask yourself, I wonder which one of these takes the most time. I've made a couple of very simple film projects myself, and I think I can fairly safely say that it's like pre-production. You think you're never going to get through it. Production, you're living on adrenaline, and everything is just like you're working so quickly and getting everything done, and that flies by. And then post-production is like this long phase of doom that can stretch out interminably, and it may never end. I mean, plenty of film projects have actually been shot, and then when you get to the post-production phase, they run out of money, or they run out of steam, or people run out of time, or they can't solve the technological issues that they're trying to solve. So post-production can just stretch out and stretch out and stretch out and stretch out. One of the reasons is because when you're in production, you shoot a massive amount of footage. How are you going to put all that together and make a film with it? So your resource guide gives you some ideas about how this works. So there's an assembly cut, and that's putting all of the footage that you think might be usable together. Then it gets condensed, chopped up, made more compact, and then you have a rough cut. Sometimes a composer will see bits of the rough cut or might see some early footage. But then you work towards a locked cut. And that's when things are pretty near where they're going to be, or maybe close to where they're going to be in terms of what you've kept and what you've thrown away. Then that's when a lot of the Foley gets added. Foley, anybody want to give me a quick definition? What's Foley mean? Yeah. Sound effects, exactly so. So a Foley artist makes the sound effects. So usually, as your resource guide says, and this is a good thing to know, I mean, if you are watching a film and you see somebody walking down a hallway and you hear clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, clop, that's almost never, conventionally speaking, recorded when that film is actually being shot. It's actually added in later by somebody with, like coconuts on a table or something. Not anymore, but a long time it was that kind of thing. Now it's more like they have that sample, that sound clip, and they're just going to drop it into the master audio file. So during the rough cut phase, that's when a composer will watch that, will develop the composition, will develop the music, and when the Foley artist will develop the Foley, and then that gets all put together into the answer print or the final cut, and that's what gets shown. So that's good to know about this process. And it's really important in talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey, as those of you who have mastered the study guide or the resource guide will know, because something really weird happened. This is an iconic disaster movie of a story. This is one of the most famous things in 20th century film history. The thing that Stanley Kubrick, the great auteur director, did to his poor, pitiful composer, Alex North. So you should know this film story just because it's an important story in culture to know. Many of you probably know what I'm talking about. Do all of you know, do you have a sense already of this Alex North, Stanley Kubrick story? Raise your hand if you have a sense of it. Awesome. Some do, some don't. It's a great story. So this is a great film and this is a great story. Know this story because it tells you a lot about the process of filmmaking, what goes into it, what the stages are when decisions are made. It's a really interesting story to learn those things. So you can learn the concepts through the story, and I think that's really a useful thing to do. Okay, so here are the basics. Stanley Kubrick, in making his rough cut, did what many film directors do. He developed a temp track. So what that means is that he thought, oh, this piece of music kind of gives me the mood that I want. So I'm going to use it while I edit to shape my editing or to give the composer an idea of the kind of music that I want during this scene. So, for example, Stanley Kubrick, in this initial sunrise sequence of 2001: A Space Odyssey, has dun 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 bum bum boom 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 boom. You know this music? Yeah. People have heard this in lots of different places. Your resource guide talks about college football games and things like that. But famous film music. This is, of course, not film music at all. It's an orchestral piece from really before the age of film. That's not entirely true, but almost before the age of film. It's written by a composer named Richard Strauss. Richard Strauss was basically a German composer, and he wrote a number of pieces for orchestra that were supposed to connect to things outside of music. Stories like the story of Don Quixote, the story of Don Juan, the story of, in this case, not a story at all, but in fact an adaptation, a musical translation of a work of philosophy by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Have you ever heard of Nietzsche? Yeah, so people will say Nietzsche, but Nietzsche. So Nietzsche wrote this volume, this philosophical treatise called Also sprach Zarathustra, thus spake, or so spoke Zarathustra. And this is connected to Zoroastrianism, but it's also connected to Nietzsche's other philosophical ideas. So it's really difficult, heady, late 19th century philosophy. And if you've seen Nietzsche's mustache, which is an incredible thing, you'll get a sense of how difficult this must have been, because nobody with a mustache like that could do anything simple. So Strauss wrote this composition, this musical work, in response to a philosophical treatise in the 1890s. Then Kubrick takes that orchestral recording that already has been made and says, oh, that's the music that I want. And he puts it in his rough cut, and that's his temp track. So temp tracking is interesting because, I like to think about this a little bit. Like, as you're editing, I'm going to say about 16 things at once here. So let me try to control myself a bit. So when you're editing, it's very hard to edit in a sonic vacuum. I don't know, have you played this game yet? Since you're getting to deal with film music, have you played the game where you watch a segment of the film and you turn off the sound? Have you played that game yet? Or in other contexts, have you played that game? Like, if you watch an action movie and you turn off all the sound, it's boring. Like, it's not interesting at all. It's just not interesting to watch. Now, if you're playing a game, like a video game, you've heard the music 100,000 times, you've heard the Foley 100,000 times, you don't need it, and you're directly engaged, it's different. But if you're sitting there, like in a theater, and there's no sound, watching just the visuals is depressing. So you can imagine, like, when you're trying to take an assembly cut to a rough cut, when you're doing that process, as an editor, as a filmic editor, how can you make it more interesting for yourself and give life to what you're doing? So the temp track helps a director do that thing. It helps guide them. It helps shape the feeling. It helps shape the contour of the cuts. So Kubrick was doubtless doing this. Like, this is what I want. I want the climax visually to happen right here. So I have this piece of music that's going to shape the scene and going to tell me when the climax needs to happen. Kubrick did this to such an extent that he developed this condition. Your resource guide tells you the phrase, but do any of you know what I'm talking about? Go ahead and scream it out if you know it. Temp love, yeah. He totally loved the temp track, so much so that he got into trouble. So he commissioned, as you do, a composer to write music for this movie. That composer was Alex North, who lived across most of the 20th century. So Alex North didn't have much time to do this, as is often the case with film composition. Like, he had a handful of weeks, essentially, to write almost an hour of cues, right? Almost an hour of music. We haven't talked about cues, but I'm going to take it as read that you know what a cue is, right? That's a segment of music that's used in a film at a particular moment. So North hastily composed like almost an hour of music, and it was recorded, and then he saw the release, and his music wasn't in the film. It had been completely shoved to the side by Kubrick, and what had been used instead? His temp track. So he used what he used to edit the film, even though he had commissioned music from the composer. He used his temp track instead, and it was one of the best decisions he ever made because this music is iconic in this film. It's stunning in this film. It's breathtaking and weird and upsetting in this film. It does all the right things and hits all the right notes. Had I been Kubrick, I hope I would have been bold enough to make that awful, wonderful decision. But of course there was a price to pay, and that price was that Alex North, who had written this music, was totally devastated, completely devastated by this decision that Kubrick had made. Kubrick hadn't even been nice enough to tell him, "Oh, Alex, thanks very much for spending like a month of your life doing nothing but slaving for me. Yeah, I'm not going to use any of your music." I mean, he didn't even tell him. Can you believe this? So this is one of the iconic stories of 20th century film history. It tells you a couple of things. It tells you about the intense labor involved in crafting a custom score for a movie. It tells you about the totalitarian aspect of some directors, even great directors, to make these calls that will ruin people's lives, at least for a little while. So there are some really interesting things it tells you about film history. It also tells you a lot about the process of filmmaking and where score fits into that process. So we've talked about those things. There's one more thing that I want to mention. I just can't leave it alone, and we've got to hurry because this is the problem. As I told you, we could spend easily the next 5 days talking just about this one film. Would we get to the bottom of it? No. We would scratch the surface in 5 days. So I'm sorry. These films are great films. You just have to see them and live with them and think about them and be with them. They just deserve your time. So the last thing that we'll say, though, is about this gentleman. Anybody want to say his name? This one right here. Yeah, close. So people will often mispronounce it. It's a Hungarian name. It's Ligeti. So you want to say Ligeti? Yeah, Ligeti, like spaghetti, right? So György Ligeti was a famous avant-garde composer. What that really means is that no normal people... Oh, it's right there at the bottom. Yep, no worries. Yeah, in the interminable list of terms. So, is that a pun? I don't know. Okay, so Ligeti was already a brilliant, famous avant-garde composer. What that really meant is that nobody outside of this little circle of nerd composers like myself knew about his music at all. But Kubrick's wife, as your resource guide helpfully tells you, had heard some of this music on the British Broadcasting Corporation, on the BBC radio, and thought, oh, that music is so weird, I'm going to share it with Stanley. So he loved it and used it, and oh, it's weird. But then, as your resource guide again tells you, Ligeti got a letter from a friend of his in New York saying, oh, congratulations, your music in 2001, A Space Odyssey, brilliant. And Ligeti was like, I had no idea I had music in this film. So he goes and he watches the film and he looks at his stopwatch and it's like, oh, 30 minutes of my music were used in this film and nobody had let me know. So then terribly, I mean, as you see in your resource guide, it only tells you a little bit of the story. It's a really juicy tale. But Ligeti said, you know what? I should probably have been paid for my music and its use in this film. So he hired this German lawyer, and the German lawyer, I don't know why it had to be a German lawyer, he hired a lawyer, and the lawyer said, we should ask for $30,000. And after like wrangling and struggling, he gets a payment of, anybody remember? $2,000, $3,000, something like that. This pittance, this like nothing of pay for contributing so significantly, so importantly to this amazing masterwork of 20th century cinema. What an insult. So Kubrick is like, I mean, what does he do to these composers? It's like he destroys Alex North and he uses Ligeti, and yet through all of that, he makes one of the greatest films of the 20th century. Stunning. So I want to finally on this slide just mention briefly a couple of concepts. You'll know these already because this is the most basic, elementary school layer of your resource guide, but I want to make sure to say it out loud. So in this initial section of the resource guide, these terms are laid out. Diegetic, non-diegetic. What does diegesis mean?
Anyway, have you talked about that? What's diegesis? If you know that, it'll help you understand the other words. Yeah.
Taking your understanding the concept first, since I know the term itself, something about the source being known, I imagine.
That's a great idea, great guess. Diegesis actually in this case means plot or story. So diegetic music means that it's part of the story's world. So
diegetic music or source music happens in the world of the characters. So somebody is sitting there at a table in a film, they turn on the radio, they hear that music from the radio, and the character hears it in the film. This is diegetic music, it's part of the story. Does everybody get that? Yeah, think of your own example. Like, think of a film that you know really well, and imagine like the characters are aware of that music. They hear a band, and the band is right in front of them. And the characters know that, and we hear it too, but it's part of the character's world. So that's diegetic music. Then we have non-diegetic music, and sometimes that's called underscoring, and your resource guide is a little more focused, a little more detailed about when you should call something underscoring, because not all non-diegetic music has to be underscore. But non-diegetic music then means non-story, but that's a little bit weird. What it really means is that music that we, the audience, hear that the characters in the film seem to be unaware of. This happens all the time, right? So Darth Vader's walking in and you hear dun 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 dun. Well, Darth Vader is not hearing this music in the film, right? Or maybe he is, but I don't think he's here. And maybe it's like a force thing, like force listening. Is that a thing? Force hearing of the score? Maybe that's a thing. But ideally, he doesn't hear this movie. All the little stormtroopers there aren't thinking like, dun, 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 oh, that's a good tune. Yeah, they're playing it well today. Like the stormtroopers aren't thinking that as they're standing there, but we hear it and it's essential for us. It sets the tone, it sets the scene, it sets the mood, connects to the motion of the scene. I mean, it's really important for us. So it's non-diegetic. Therefore, in film, this is one of the things that I love about film. It's almost as if you have two narrations that open up. One narration is the world of the characters, what they're telling you, what they're doing, what the images are showing you. And we also have the music and what it's telling you. And these two are not necessarily aware of each other. So you have amazing possibilities in cinema, like you're watching a film and the characters on screen are telling you one thing and the music is telling you something different. Whose set of meanings do you believe? So these are the things that film can do for us. You know, it can give us multiple simultaneous narration. It's an amazing thing, amazing medium. So now we move from amazing to amazing. Oh, Dune. I don't know if you okay, so again, I just can't resist. I can't help myself. How many of you have seen the David Lynch Dune? Yes. I want to say from my own Gen X super science fiction nerd, film nerd perspective, see this film. I can't quite bring myself to do it, but I really want to do it because Dune is awful and awesome. It's just so greatly bad and badly great. Oh, Dune, it's so cool. Like, it's a Baroque mistake. It's a massive travesty of how many costumes? Do you remember this from your resource guide? 4,000 costumes? How many extras? Do you remember this? Like 20,000 people appear in this film. Now, as you know, like they'd just all be animated. You know, it would all be on a computer and somebody just presses beep and like all these soldiers run. But this had like 20,000 people involved on screen. They don't make movies like that anymore. So Dune is incredible in that way. Also, David Lynch is just the weirdest director. And I mean, to see a David Lynch film is to be treated to A way of thinking that most people don't share. And that's probably a good thing, and yet it's fascinating to watch a Lynch film because he'll reveal things to you that you didn't know were there about your subconscious, about, like lurking subterranean desires that you don't want to acknowledge. That's the kind of world that Lynch likes to play in. So Dune is amazing and, again, terrible. So in this film, one of the cool things is that it's not a conventional orchestral score, like a Star Wars-y kind of score. And people thought that it might be because Star Wars is 77, Dune's 84, it's a massive sci-fi masterpiece. It's made based on Frank Herbert's Dune, that novel that like changed science fiction and elevated science fiction to the realm of literature. I don't necessarily recommend that you watch Lynch's Dune. I do recommend that you read Frank Herbert's Dune, which is a totally amazing book. What a great book. So still has loads of things for us to chew on. It's such a cool book. And the whole Dune universe that gets created from it is pretty cool too, but maybe you shouldn't read those, but at least read Dune. So in Dune of 1984, instead of having a single composer write the whole score, it's actually a band that writes the score. Toto, as your resource guide tells you, of songs like Africa. So if you know that song, that 80s classic 80s pop song, then you've heard that sound. Now they had just lost their main singer, so the band was looking for something to do. Apparently, I didn't know this until I read your resource guide. This is why I love doing this. I learn all sorts of weird things. So your resource guide says that Toto was actually offered a choice of projects. Did you catch one of the other projects? Yeah. Footloose. That's wild. It's like, okay, Toto, you can do Footloose or Dune. If you've seen Footloose, you know what a hilarious choice that is. But Toto chose Dune because it's like, oh, that'll be Star Wars-y. But no, it's absolutely as trippy as it can be. So I want to mention a couple of things here. Your resource guide mentions in some detail the motivic material that opens up like the opening credits of Dune. And it shows you this little dun, 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 and it keeps going again and again and again. And you might feel like after you've heard it a lot, oh, okay, I get it. It is a rock band. They had a little hook. They thought that hook was really neat, and they just repeated it again and again and again until you couldn't get it out of your head. And this is maybe like more rock thinking than it is classical composer thinking. So some of that makes sense. On the other hand, it's fleshed out, like it's filled out. Vienna Phil or something had played the score for them. So it's like both rock and then it takes a step into symphonic music. It takes a step into orchestral scoring. Then also, this is just briefly mentioned in your resource guide, but it's a really cool thing. Major 80s producer Brian Eno also contributed melodic material and production material to that score. So like Brian Eno's involved, Toto's involved, but the Vienna Philharmonic is involved. Like this other major choir from Vienna is involved. So it's this interesting hybrid. And then your resource guide also talks about this. I love this. It talks about tritone juxtaposition, chords built on this tritone relationship. Now, yet again, if you don't speak the language of music theory, or if you're like looking at that wall of reading music and you think, I'm not going to be able to climb over that in this year or this semester, then maybe this part of the resource guide was kind of opaque to you, and maybe you felt like, this isn't here for me. However, I challenge you, like go to that part of the resource guide where that series of chords is being discussed. See if you can hear what the resource guide is talking about, because actually it's a pretty cool sound, and it's not something that you encounter in like a lot of popular music or actually music anywhere outside of classical music and film scoring. Maybe though you might encounter it in a video game score. So what does this chord progression do? So I'll tell you just a couple of things about it super fast. If you're thinking about like the chromatic scale from C up to B, and then you hit your octave at C again, there's a place like C to C that's one octave. So it's essentially the same note, da, da, right? Same note, just an octave different. So If you go halfway between this C and the next C, that point is the tritone. It's as far away from home as you can get in either direction. So what this progression does is it starts at home, goes as far away from home as you can possibly get. So it juxtaposes those two sounds, those two major chords. They don't belong in the same key. They don't belong in the same tonality. It's a jarring, weird, almost like strangely dissonant experience to hear those two chords next to each other. Why? Why would they do that? Well, your resource guide says, all these music scholars say, this is because of the weirdness of the dramatic event being depicted. Can you put the pieces of that puzzle together? It's like home, away from home, home. Home, farthest from home that I can be, home. Does that make sense in outer space? The area of the unfamiliar. Does that make sense in science fiction, where the alien that you don't know what to do with shows up on your doorstep? Yeah, it kind of does. It kind of does make a sort of strange sense that this musical habit would have developed in composers that actually represents in music theory, in the language of the nuts and bolts of music, that actually does represent how far from home could I get? So this is the whole point of that section, and you hear it embedded in the opening, in the title music of Dune. So you'll hear that tritone progression, and I just encourage you to spend a little time with it. If you can hear it, if you can identify it once, you can identify it again. And then once you identify it multiple times, you start to build a network for yourself in your mind of habits that composers have and ways that they communicate that often are like sub rosa, that are often like, they're underneath the surface and most people don't notice them. I'm going to say one thing, I really don't have time for it, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'll never forget this interview that I watched with Julia Roberts. Do you know Julia Roberts? Do you know who that is? Raise your hand if you know who Julia Roberts is. Okay. So, Julia Roberts, famous actress, she's sitting in this interview and she says, I think the best kind of music in movies is music that nobody notices, but it affects them anyway. And like, as a musician, I'm like, no, crushed, because for me, the whole idea is like, you can focus on the music and be fascinated by it, and it can add to the experience of the film. So I'm going to encourage you, like, as you get deeper into the resource guide and learn more about what the resource guide is telling you, give it a try. See if you can actually hear that tritone relationship, because if you can create your own conversation with all these other film composers, with all these other video game composers who are using the same pack of tricks to tell you the same sort of things. It's a cool experience to be talking with them instead of manipulated by them, right? Okay, so quickly to the Krell. So this is another strange choice. I couldn't resist it. I couldn't help myself. Again, if I had written the resource guide, I would have talked about this film. How many of you seen, by show of hands, Forbidden Planet? Okay, this group, you're watching the movies. This is amazing. Coach, well done. Yeah, is it like a group activity? Yes, I love this. This is inspirational. Is it fun? Just say yes. Oh, wow. Oh, what a shame. Oh. So I'll tell you though, look at this scene. Look at this scene. Is this not amazing? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. So in the 1950s, to make a scene like this and to build this like subterranean Krell technology that was tens of thousands of years ahead of the travelers from Earth who visit the Forbidden Planet, nobody had ever done anything like this. And why was that? It was because it was a B-movie idea that had a budget from MGM. As your resource guide tells you. Like MGM said, they gave it the green light. They said, okay, we're going to make Forbidden Planet on an MGM budget. When they did this, this kind of thing became possible. If you look at early B-movies, like other, even later B-movies, if you look at B-movies from yesterday, then you do see the strings. Like you see the strings holding up Godzilla. You see, that this is clearly a model. You see like, oh, somebody filmed this in their bathtub and it's supposed to be the ocean. Like you see all of that. And then you watch Forbidden Planet and it's not like that. It's visionary. It's because they had money, So one of the other things that's so visionary about it is that they completely denied orchestral scoring. They decided not to have an orchestral score at all. Instead, they decided to have a score that would match the technological innovations that were at the heart of the plot of the film. How did they do this? They hired people who had no money and no name and no fame and no history in the film industry, Bibi and Louis Barron, husband and wife team. They hired them to basically hang out in their basement and make an electronic music score, which is just the coolest story of all time. I mean, that's so lo-fi, make it DIY, make it on your own, heroic. And all sorts of things that MGM did that were awesome, like MGM recorded scores in the studio lot, period. That's the way business worked. This golden age of Hollywood, if you're gonna make a score for a movie, you show up at the MGM lot and you make the score there. They gave permission for Louis and Bibi Barron to make it in their home. Again, like to put it together in their basement. And so it's an incredible, unlikely combination of weirdnesses. The Barons made a score that, as your resource guide tells you, but you can't believe it unless you listen to the stuff. And it's all good and well to listen to that listening example that you have, but this group knows what it's about because you listen to the whole score. Like the whole score is bleeps and bloops and weird electronic buzzings and strange pads that emerge. And mostly, as your resource guide explains, a lot of it was made from like close miking of circuits and the beauty that those circuits would make before they popped or cracked or broke or whatever. So the Barons recorded all of that, then they manipulated it on magnetic tape, like reel-to-reel tape machines. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should look it up online. Just look it up on your phone what a Ampeg tape recorder looks like. And just appreciate like that if they wanted to do certain things, they had to splice tape, like they had to cut pieces of magnetic tape, tape them together again, do all sorts of technological tricks with this magnetic tape recorder in order to make the beautiful score that emerges from this. And I say beautiful, it's weird, it's a bizarre score, but wonderfully bizarre. It opens the mind to new possibilities. And when it does that, it's doing exactly what the Krell do for the visitors from Earth. So they couldn't call it a score, they would have gotten in trouble with the union or some such. So instead, they marketed this whole score as electronic tonalities. That way it wasn't actually music. So I love that part of your resource guide. It tells you a lot about the music industry. Finally, the last thing that I say here is musique concrète on this slide. What that means, it's a French 1940s, 1950s term for sampling. So what we're actually talking about here is sampling. It's a sample-based score. And as you know, like sampling was going to be the way of the future. Like you sample something and you loop it, there's contemporary music for you, right? So in fact, what we're seeing in this score is the origin story of sample-based music. It doesn't sound like a lot of sample-based music now. However, the connection to electronic music, to electronic dance music, is profound. Like the Barons were godfathers and godmothers of this whole electronic music trend. That they're pairing it with such an interesting science fiction film, even if you fell asleep, it's still interesting. All right, so we'll say a couple of things very quickly about Blade Runner, because we're out of time, basically. See, this is bad. I'm sorry. I didn't realize how easy it would be to talk for 17 hours about one film, but it's very easy to do. So let's talk just briefly about Blade Runner. How many of you have seen Blade Runner? Good. More of you should see it. It should be everyone. It's a dark film. Like it's cyberpunk, right? So Philip K. Dick wrote the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, that novella that is the basis of the story. However, this film would never have been made in the way that it was made had cyberpunk not happened in the late 70s, early 80s in science fiction. So it's kind of like a revision of Philip K. Dick with a solid dose of contemporary sci-fi thinking. And if you look at this image, I don't know if any of you have seen that awful Star Wars movie, Attack of the Clones, but if you've seen that, or if you've seen like the sequel Star Wars movies and seen what Coruscant, the big planet that's a city, looks like, it looks a lot like this. Well, of course it does, because Blade Runner is one of the most influential films of all time. Every director steals from it, religiously. It's like it's a way of life. So Blade Runner is amazing. It's amazing. I mentioned a couple of names here. Robert Moog. So anybody know the instrument that's associated with him? It's called the Moog. So the Moog is a synthesizer that's connected to a keyboard. Now, for most of you whose like older brothers wanted to be in a rock band and had a Casio, or maybe that was just me, but if you were in that place, then you think of a synthesizer as always connected to a keyboard. That's not the origin of synthesizers. Synthesizers originally were like patch bays, and they were knobs and cables, and that's what a synthesizer looked like. But Moog had this brilliant idea. What if I connect all of that hardware that nobody knows what to do with something that people do know what to do with? What if I connect it to an actual keyboard? Looks like a piano. And when Moog did that, he caused a revolution. Like, not just in weird avant-garde music, but in classical music and in scoring and in pop, or things that are similar to pop. So Moog did that. I mentioned Wendy Carlos, who created an album in the late 60s called Switched on Bach. And it uses the music of J.S. Bach, but it's all on Moog synthesizers. An amazing listening experience. So fast forward to 1982, we have the Greek composer Vangelis. Vangelis wrote his score for Blade Runner almost entirely, not completely, but almost entirely on his CS80 synthesizer. It has a gorgeous sound. Like, that's the sound of Vangelis for sure, the CS80. And when you hear like that ending sequence, which is really cool music. Do you like that? Do you like, oh man, it's awesome. It sounds like Stranger Things, right? Actually, Stranger Things sounds like it. So that's the way it works. So it's a really influential, really important sound, but Vangelis used the synthesizer in amazing ways for this film to set the mood and to kind of give you that future noir quality that your resource guide talks about. So because we're basically out of time now, I'm just going to skip through the last couple of slides. Poor Star Wars, it suffers. We would have talked about the Cantina Band and finding Benny Goodman under a rock, which I love. That's a great story. One of the things you have to respect about Star Wars is Dolby Stereo, right? That means sound coming at you from the left and the right, and it's not the same. So it's not just a mono track, it's stereo. This sounds better. So thanks Star Wars for making sound in cinema better. We could have talked about leitmotifs for a little bit, which means themes that are connected to characters or ideas in the context of film. That's an old idea. It's a 19th century opera idea. Your resource guide refuses to say the name, but I'm going to say it. Richard Wagner. So Wagner's operas are the source in many ways for this kind of leitmotivic thinking. And finally, WALL-E was the other one that we were going to mention just briefly. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about that, and one of the reasons it's so fascinating, is that when you look at earlier science fiction film, and indeed early film in general, what you see is always references to classical music on stage or opera on stage. By the time we get to the 21st century, when film composers reference the past, their past is actually cinema. So instead of referencing like music that was in a different venue, they're now referencing the long history of film music itself. So film has become its own story. That's one of the amazing things about WALL-E, that incredible treatment that Thomas Newman does of the music from that cool film. So I'm going to put this slide up here. If any of you are interested in studying music at UIW, we would love to hear from you. So you're welcome to text the word music to that number, and you'll instantly be connected with us. So if any of you are interested in that, I'll go ahead and offer that to you. But more importantly, about the resource guide, I think, it's fun. So it's not very often that you can have so much fun studying a unit. But I think this is just so well written, such a blast. So please don't forget to enjoy yourself while you're learning all these things about science fiction film scoring. Thanks very much. We'll have a brief break and we'll reconvene right at 9 for the next lecture. Thanks.